My son humiliated me and shouted, "Get out of my house, you are nobody." What he didn't know was that I had just won 18 million, so I simply said, "All right," and didn't fight. The next day, I moved into a private villa in Italy. 3 weeks later, I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Charles and I'm 60 years old. I never thought I'd be telling this story, but here I am, sitting in my new home thousands of miles away from everything I once called family. What happened 3 months ago changed everything, but not in the way my son Stanley expected. It was a Tuesday morning in October when my world shifted forever. I had driven over to Stanley's house, like I did every week, to help with small repairs around the property. At 60, my hands weren't as steady as they used to be, but I could still fix a leaky faucet or change a light bulb. Stanley never asked for my help directly, but his wife Miranda would always find something that needed attention whenever I visited. That morning I was replacing a broken tile in their kitchen backsplash. Stanley had been pacing around the house all morning, his phone pressed to his ear, talking loudly about some business deal that wasn't going his way. I tried to stay out of his way, working quietly in the corner. But when I accidentally knocked over a small container of grout, spilling it on their pristine white countertop, everything exploded. "Are you kidding me right now?" Stanley's voice cut through the kitchen like a knife. He hung up his phone and stormed over to where I was frantically trying to clean up the mess. "Look at this disaster you've made." I looked up at my son, this man I had raised, fed, and put through college, and saw nothing but contempt in his eyes. "Stanley, I'm sorry. Let me just clean this up, and I'll—" "No." His voice was cold, final. "I'm done with this. I'm done with you coming here and messing things up." Miranda appeared in the doorway, her arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with what looked like satisfaction. She had never liked me much, always treating me like an unwelcome guest in their home. "Honey, maybe it's time we had this conversation," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. Stanley nodded, his jaw clenched tight. "You're right." He turned back to me, and I could see years of resentment bubbling to the surface. "Dad, you need to leave and don't come back." I felt my chest tighten. "Stanley, what are you saying?" "I'm saying get out of my house." His voice rose to a shout that echoed through their large kitchen. "You show up here every week, breaking things, getting in the way, acting like we owe you something. You don't contribute anything to this family. You're nobody. You're nothing." The words hit me like physical blows. I stood there, grout still on my hands, looking at my son who was red-faced with anger, and his wife who was nodding in agreement behind him. "You're nobody." Those words would echo in my mind for weeks. I could have told him right then about the $18 million sitting in my bank account. I could have explained how I had won the lottery 6 months earlier, how I had been quietly managing my newfound wealth while trying to figure out what to do with it. I could have told him that I didn't need his charity, that I came to his house every week, not because I was lonely or desperate, but because I wanted to spend time with my son and grandchildren. But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I set down the grout container, wiped my hands on the towel I had brought, and nodded slowly. "All right," I said quietly. "If that's what you want." Stanley seemed surprised by my calm response. I think he had expected me to argue, to plead, to make a scene. But I had learned long ago that dignity was sometimes the only thing you could control in a situation like this. "Dad, he started, perhaps realizing he had gone too far. "It's fine, Stanley." I gathered my tools methodically, placing each one back in my toolbox with deliberate care. "I understand." As I walked toward the front door, I could hear Miranda whispering to Stanley behind me. "You did the right thing," she was saying. "He was becoming too dependent on us." I paused at the door, my hand on the handle. For just a moment, I considered turning around and telling them exactly what I thought of their cruelty. I thought about the bank statements hidden in my desk drawer, about the financial advisor who had been calling me twice a week, about the investment opportunities I had been quietly researching. Instead, I opened the door and stepped out into the cool October air. "Take care of yourselves," I called back, though I'm not sure they heard me. I sat in my car for several minutes before starting the engine. My hands were shaking, not from age or weakness, but from the sheer magnitude of what had just happened. My son had just told me I was nobody, that I contributed nothing to the family I had spent 60 years building and protecting. The drive home was a blur. I found myself thinking about Stanley as a little boy, how he used to run to the door when I came home from work. how he would climb into my lap while I read the newspaper. When had it all changed? When had I become such a burden to him? But as I pulled into my driveway, I felt something unexpected, relief. For months, I had been carrying the secret of my lottery winnings, unsure how to tell my family, worried about how it might change our relationships. Now, ironically, Stanley had made that decision for me. That evening, I called my financial advisor. "Robert," I said when he answered, "I think it's time we had that conversation about international investments." As I hung up the phone, I realized that Stanley had just given me the greatest gift he could have given me, my freedom. What he didn't know was that tomorrow, everything would change. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. Stanley's words still stung, but they had also done something unexpected. They had set me free from an obligation I didn't even realize I had been carrying. I made my coffee and sat at my kitchen table, looking around the small house I had called home for the past 15 years. After Stanley's mother died when he was 25, I had downsized to this modest 2-bedroom place, thinking I didn't need much space for just myself. The house was clean but worn, filled with furniture from the 1980s and family photos that suddenly felt like artifacts from someone else's life. My phone buzzed with a text message. For a moment my heart jumped, thinking it might be Stanley calling to apologize. But it was just my neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, asking if I could help her move some boxes later. I realized that this was what my life had become, a series of small favors for other people, filling time until my weekly visits to Stanley's house, which had apparently been more of an intrusion than I understood. I spent the morning making phone calls, first to Robert, my financial advisor, then to a real estate agent in Tuscany, whose contact information I had been carrying in my wallet for 3 months. When I won the lottery, I had fantasized about buying a small villa in Italy, somewhere peaceful, where I could spend my remaining years reading, gardening, maybe learning to paint. It had seemed like an impossible dream then, something too indulgent for a man who had spent his whole life being practical. "Mr. Charles," the agent, Francesca, said in accented English, "the property we discussed is still available. When would you like to schedule a viewing?" "I don't need a viewing," I told her, surprising myself with my decisiveness. "I trust your judgment. Let's proceed with the purchase." By noon, I had made an offer on a 3-bedroom villa in a small town outside Florence. By evening, it was accepted. $18 million was more money than I could spend in several lifetimes, but for the first time since winning, I felt good about spending some of it. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. I contacted a moving company that specialized in international relocations. I arranged for most of my furniture to be donated to charity. I wanted to start fresh, to buy new things that had no memories attached to them. I kept only the essentials, my clothes, my books, and a few photographs from happier times. I thought about calling Stanley to tell him about my plans, but every time I reached for the phone, I remembered his words, "You're nobody." If I was nobody to him, then perhaps it was better if nobody simply disappeared. The hardest part was going through 40 years of memories. I found Stanley's report cards from elementary school, all A's and B's, with teacher comments about what a bright, thoughtful boy he was. There were photos from his high school graduation, his college graduation, his wedding day. In every picture, he looked happy, successful, surrounded by people who loved him. I wondered when I had stopped being one of those people. I discovered a box of letters I had written to Stanley during his first year of college but never sent. They were full of advice, encouragement, and love. All the things I wanted to say but was too proud or too awkward to express. Reading them now, I realized that somewhere along the way, I had stopped trying to communicate with my son. Our relationship had become superficial, built around small tasks and obligatory visits rather than real connection. One letter, dated October 20th, 23 years ago, particularly struck me. "Stanley, I hope you know how proud I am of the man you're becoming. Sometimes I worry that I'm not the father you need, that I don't have the right words to guide you through life's challenges. But I want you to know that everything I do, every choice I make, is with your happiness in mind. You are my greatest accomplishment and my deepest love." I had never given him that letter. Instead, I had probably criticized his grades or worried about his spending money. How many opportunities for connection had I missed over the years? But as I packed these memories away, I realized something important. I had spent too many years defining myself through my relationship with Stanley. I was more than just his father. I was Charles Morrison, 60 years old, with interests and dreams and a whole life ahead of me. On my last morning in the house, Mrs. Henderson knocked on my door. "Charles, dear, I haven't seen you outside much lately. Are you feeling all right?" I smiled at her. This kind woman who had been my neighbor for 10 years and had never once made me feel like a burden. I'm feeling better than I have in a long time, actually. I'm moving to Italy. Her eyes widened. Italy? How wonderful. But so sudden. Sometimes the best decisions are the sudden ones, I told her. As the moving truck pulled away that afternoon, I stood on the sidewalk looking at my empty house. I had left no forwarding address for Stanley. I had canceled my local phone service and would get an international plan once I arrived in Italy. For the first time in my adult life, no one knew where I was going or what I was planning to do. It felt terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. The flight to Italy was the longest I had ever taken. As the plane lifted off from the airport, I watched my hometown shrink beneath me until it disappeared entirely. I thought about Stanley, probably going about his daily routine, unaware that his father was 30,000 feet in the air, traveling toward a completely new life. I wondered if he would notice I was gone, or if my absence would be as unremarkable to him as my presence had apparently become. But for the first time in years, that thought didn't fill me with sadness. Instead, I felt something I had almost forgotten, anticipation for what tomorrow might bring. 3 weeks had passed since I settled into my villa in Montefiore, a small hilltop town 30 minutes from Florence. The house was everything I had dreamed of. Stone walls that had stood for centuries, a garden overlooking rolling hills covered in olive trees, and a peace so complete that I could hear church bells from the village below every morning at 7. I had established a routine that felt both foreign and natural. I woke early, made coffee on my new Italian espresso machine, and sat on my terrace reading books I had always meant to read but never had time for. In the afternoons, I explored the local markets, slowly learning Italian phrases from vendors who were patient with my broken pronunciation. Evenings were spent in my garden, planning where I would plant tomatoes and herbs come spring. For the first time in decades, I felt genuinely content. I wasn't checking my phone every few minutes, hoping for a call from Stanley. I wasn't planning my weeks around visits that were clearly unwanted. I was simply living, breathing, existing for myself. But back in Ohio, things were beginning to shift in ways I couldn't have imagined. Stanley had always been a creature of habit. Every Tuesday morning, he would look out his kitchen window while making his coffee, expecting to see my old blue Honda pulling into his driveway. The first Tuesday after our confrontation, he felt a sense of relief when the driveway remained empty. He told Miranda that maybe his father had finally gotten the message. The second Tuesday, he felt nothing, just the absence of something that had been there before. By the third Tuesday, he found himself actually looking for my car. Not because he wanted to see me, he told himself, but because the break-in routine felt oddly unsettling. It's weird, he mentioned to Miranda over breakfast. Dad hasn't tried to call or anything. Usually when we fight, he calls within a few days to smooth things over. Miranda looked up from her tablet where she was scrolling through social media. Maybe he finally realized you meant what you said. Honestly, Stanley, it's better this way. You don't need that kind of stress. But something in Stanley's expression made her pause. You're not having second thoughts, are you? No, he said quickly. It's just, I don't know. Different. What Stanley didn't know was that his neighbors had begun to notice changes too. Mrs. Patterson, who lived next door to my old house, had called the local police on Thursday morning. Officer, I'm concerned about my neighbor, Charles Morrison, she told the dispatcher. I haven't seen him in over 2 weeks. His mail is piling up, and there's been no activity at the house at all. The police did a welfare check, peering through windows and knocking on doors. They found no signs of disturbance, but they also found no signs of life. The house appeared to be completely empty. Mrs. Patterson decided to call Stanley. She had met him a few times over the years when he visited his father, and she had his number from a neighborhood contact list. Stanley, this is Eleanor Patterson, your father's neighbor. I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm worried about Charles. I haven't seen him in weeks, and the police just checked his house. It looks like he's moved out. Stanley felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Moved out? That's impossible. He's lived there for 15 years. I know, dear. That's why I'm concerned. Did he mention anything to you about going somewhere? Stanley's mind raced back to our last conversation. He had been so angry, so caught up in his own frustration, that he hadn't really listened to anything I might have said afterward. Had I mentioned travel plans? Had I said anything about leaving? No, he told Mrs. Patterson. He didn't say anything about moving. After hanging up, Stanley sat in his kitchen staring at his phone. He tried calling my number, but it went straight to a message saying the number was no longer in service. A strange panic began to build in his chest. "Miranda," he called to his wife, who was upstairs getting ready for work. "Something's wrong with Dad." She came downstairs checking her earrings in the hallway mirror. "What do you mean?" His neighbor called. "She thinks he moved out of his house, and his phone's disconnected." Miranda's reflection met his eyes in the mirror. "Maybe he's staying with your aunt or something. Didn't he have a sister?" Stanley shook his head. "Aunt Helen died 3 years ago. You were at the funeral with me." "Oh." Miranda adjusted her earrings again, a nervous habit Stanley had noticed she'd developed lately. "Well, I'm sure there's an explanation. Maybe he's just taking some time to think about what you said." But Stanley wasn't convinced. He drove to my house that afternoon, using the spare key I had given him years earlier for emergencies. The house was indeed empty, but not ransacked or abandoned. It was methodically, deliberately emptied. Everything valuable was gone, but there was no sign of struggle or hurried departure. In my bedroom closet, he found something that made his blood run cold. A stack of real estate brochures for properties in Europe. Italy, specifically. The brochures were months old, marked with handwritten notes in my careful script. Notes about square footage, proximity to airports, costs of international moving services. Stanley sank onto my bed, holding the brochures with shaking hands. This hadn't been a sudden decision triggered by their fight. I had been planning this for months. In my desk drawer, he found more evidence of my methodical planning. Correspondence with banks about international wire transfers, research about Italian visa requirements for retirees, even language learning materials. Everything was organized in neat folders, dated and labeled in the careful way I had always approached important decisions. At the very back of the drawer, Stanley found something that stopped him cold. A copy of a lottery claim form. The winning amount was clearly visible. $18 million. The date was 6 months ago. Stanley stared at the number until his eyes watered. $18 million. His father, the man he had called nobody, the man he had accused of contributing nothing to the family, had won $18 million and never said a word. He thought about all the times over the past 6 months when I had seemed different somehow, calmer, less anxious about money. The times I had insisted on paying for dinner when we occasionally went out together. The way I had stopped asking to borrow his tools and had shown up with my own, nicer ones. Stanley's phone buzzed with a text from Miranda. "Did you find anything at your dad's house?" He stared at the lottery form, at the real estate brochures, at the evidence of a life carefully planned and executed without any input from him. He thought about typing back the truth, but something stopped him. Instead, he wrote, "Still looking. Call you later." Stanley spent another hour in my empty house, sitting in rooms where we had shared meals, conversations, and quiet moments watching television together. He tried to remember the last time we had really talked about something meaningful, and he couldn't. When had I stopped being his father and become just an obligation? When had our relationship deteriorated to the point where I felt I had to plan an entire new life in secret? As he locked the house and walked back to his car, Stanley felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Genuine fear. Not fear of physical danger, but fear that he had made a mistake so profound that it couldn't be undone. For the first time since our fight, Stanley wondered if he had been wrong about everything. Stanley didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the lottery form and real estate brochures spread across his nightstand like evidence of a crime he was only beginning to understand. $18 million. The number kept cycling through his mind, along with fragments of our last conversation. "You don't contribute anything to this family. You're nobody." The words that had felt so justified in the moment now felt like poison in his memory. At 3 a.m, he gave up on sleep and went downstairs to his computer. He started searching for any trace of my recent activities online. Flight records, hotel bookings, anything that might give him a clue about where I had gone. Miranda found him there at 6 a.m., still in his pajamas, surrounded by printed emails and bank statements he had found in my house. "Stanley, you look terrible. Did you sleep at all?" He looked up at her with hollow eyes. "Miranda, we need to talk." She poured herself coffee and sat across from him at their kitchen table, the same table where he had exploded at me 3 weeks earlier. Stanley spread out the documents like a detective presenting evidence. "Dad won the lottery 6 months ago. $18 million. Miranda's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. "What?" "Look at this." Stanley showed her the lottery claim form, the bank statements showing massive deposits, the correspondence with financial advisors. He's been planning to move to Italy for months. This wasn't some sudden reaction to our fight. He was already leaving. Miranda studied the papers, her face growing pale. Stanley, this means I just threw away my relationship with my father over fixing a broken tile while he was secretly a millionaire. Stanley's voice cracked. It means everything I said to him, every assumption I made about his life, was completely wrong. The weight of the situation began to settle on both of them. Miranda, who had encouraged Stanley's harsh words, who had nodded approvingly when he told me to leave, now found herself staring at evidence of a man who had chosen to live modestly despite enormous wealth. Why didn't he tell us? She whispered. Stanley ran his hands through his hair. Maybe because he knew this is exactly how we'd react. Maybe he wanted to see if we cared about him for who he was, not what he had. The phone rang, startling them both. It was Mrs. Patterson again. Stanley, dear, I've been thinking about your father all night. I found something that might help. Her voice was gentle but urgent. I was going through my mail yesterday and found a letter that was delivered to my house by mistake. It's addressed to Charles, but it's from something called International Property Services. It looks important. Stanley was at Mrs. Patterson's house within 15 minutes. The letter was indeed from a property management company, but it was in Italian. Using his phone to translate, Stanley was able to make out references to a property in Montefiore, Italy, and monthly service charges. His hands were shaking as he called the number listed on the letterhead. Pronto, International Property Services, a woman answered in accented English. Hello, I'm looking for information about Charles Morrison. I believe he may have purchased property through your company. There was a pause. May I ask who is calling? I'm his son, Stanley Morrison. He's missing. We're very worried about him. Another pause, then. Mr. Morrison is not missing, sir. He is a client of ours. He purchased a beautiful villa in Montefiore 3 weeks ago. But I cannot give you any more information without his permission. Stanley felt a mixture of relief and desperation. Please, I just need to know if he's okay. We had a terrible fight, and I'm afraid I said things. I need to apologize to him. The woman's voice softened slightly. Mr. Morrison seemed very happy when he took possession of the property. He said he was looking forward to a peaceful retirement. But again, I cannot provide personal information without his consent. After hanging up, Stanley sat in his car outside Mrs. Patterson's house, feeling more lost than ever. I was alive, I was well, and I was living in Italy, but I was also completely unreachable, having severed all the connections that had tied me to my old life. Over the next week, Stanley's search became increasingly frantic. He hired a private investigator to try to locate me in Italy. He contacted the State Department to see if they could help him reach an American citizen abroad. He even considered flying to Italy himself, though he had no idea where in the country to look. The investigator, a patient man named David Torres, called Stanley with updates every few days. Your father has done an impressive job of disappearing, Mr. Morrison, David told him during one call. He's closed all his local accounts, forwarded no mail, left no emergency contacts. It's like he planned this very carefully. Because he did plan it, Stanley said bitterly. While I was treating him like a burden, he was planning his escape. David's voice was gentle. Sir, if I may say so, it sounds like your father isn't hiding from you because he's angry. It sounds like he's protecting himself from further hurt. In my experience, that kind of departure usually comes after years of feeling unwanted. Those words hit Stanley like a physical blow. Years of feeling unwanted. He thought about all the times I had offered to help with yard work, house repairs, babysitting the grandchildren. How often had he accepted that help grudgingly, making it clear he was doing me a favor by letting me contribute? When had helping my own son become something I had to be grateful for permission to do? Miranda noticed the change in Stanley during this period. He became withdrawn, distracted, consumed with guilt and regret. He stopped eating regular meals, stopped watching television in the evenings, stopped engaging with their children in any meaningful way. You're destroying yourself over this, she told him one evening. Maybe your father just needed space. Maybe he'll come back when he's ready. But Stanley knew better. I wasn't coming back. The evidence was too clear, too methodical. I had closed the door on my old life completely. And Stanley was beginning to understand that he was the one who had forced me to close it. The private investigator called with a final report after 2 weeks of searching. Mr. Morrison, I've located the general area where your father is living, but I cannot provide specific information about his residence or contact details without his consent. What I can tell you is that he appears to have integrated well into his new community. Local sources indicate he's learning the language, participating in community activities, and seems content. Stanley hung up the phone and buried his face in his hands. I was building a new life, making new friends, finding happiness, all without him. The son who had once been the center of my world was now just a painful memory I had left behind in another country. That night, Stanley made a decision that surprised even himself. He booked a flight to Italy. I have to try, he told Miranda. I have to find him and tell him I'm sorry. Even if he won't forgive me, he needs to know that I understand what I did wrong. Miranda looked at her husband, this man who had been so certain of his righteousness just a month earlier, now broken by the weight of his own actions. What if he won't see you? She asked quietly. Stanley picked up one of the real estate brochures from my house, studying the photo of a stone villa surrounded by olive trees. Then at least I'll know I tried. But what Stanley didn't know was that I had been watching for signs of his search, and I had been preparing for this possibility all along. Stanley's flight to Florence was the longest 8 hours of his life. He spent most of the journey staring out the window, rehearsing what he would say to me if he found me. The words seemed inadequate for the magnitude of what he had discovered about himself, about us, about the years of misunderstanding that had led to this moment. He had brought with him a folder containing copies of all the documents he had found in my house, the lottery ticket, the bank statements, the real estate brochures, evidence of a father he had never really known, despite living in the same town for 35 years. When he arrived in Florence, Stanley rented a car and drove to Montefiore, following directions he had printed from the internet. The small hilltop town was exactly as beautiful as the photographs had suggested, with narrow stone streets and views that stretched for miles across the Tuscan countryside. He checked into a small hotel in the village center and began his search. Montefiore was tiny, fewer than 2,000 residents, so Stanley reasoned it wouldn't take long to find me. He was both right and wrong about that. At the hotel desk, he asked the clerk about American residents. "See, there is an American gentleman who moved here recently," the young woman told him in careful English. "Very nice man. He comes to the market on Thursdays, speaks Italian with the vendors. Everyone likes him very much." Stanley's heart jumped. "Can you tell me where he lives?" The clerk shook her head. "I am sorry, but we cannot give out personal information about residents. Perhaps you could wait until Thursday and see him at the market." But Stanley couldn't wait 3 days. He spent the next 2 days walking through every street in Montefiore, looking for signs of my presence. He showed my photograph to shopkeepers, restaurant owners, anyone who would listen to his broken Italian and patient English. Finally, on his second afternoon, he found someone who recognized me. An elderly man named Giuseppe, who owned a small hardware store, smiled broadly when Stanley showed him my picture. "Ah, sì, Carlo," Giuseppe exclaimed, using the Italian version of my name. "Very good man. He buy many things for his garden. Lives in the villa with the blue shutters, up the hill past the church." Stanley's hands were shaking as he got directions to my house. The walk up the hillside took 15 minutes, his heart pounding harder with each step. When he finally reached the stone villa with blue shutters, he stopped at the gate and stared. The property was beautiful, more beautiful than any place I had ever lived. A well-maintained garden stretched around the house, filled with olive trees and herbs. Through the windows, he could see warm light and simple, elegant furniture. It looked like the home of someone who had found peace. Stanley stood at my gate for nearly an hour, working up the courage to knock. What would he say? How could he possibly explain or apologize for what he had done? How could he make amends for years of taking me for granted, for treating my love like an obligation rather than a gift? Finally, as the sun was beginning to set behind the hills, he opened the gate and walked up the stone path to my front door. Before he could change his mind, he knocked. I opened the door wearing a simple sweater and reading glasses, holding a book in Italian. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I looked older somehow, but also more relaxed than Stanley remembered. The constant tension he was used to seeing in my face had been replaced by something that looked like contentment. "Hello, Stanley," I said quietly. "Dad." His voice broke on the word. I've been looking for you." I nodded slowly, as if I'd been expecting this visit. Would you like to come in? We sat in my living room, which was furnished simply but comfortably. Stanley noticed Italian language books on the coffee table, local newspapers, a half-finished watercolor painting on an easel by the window. This wasn't the life of someone who was hiding or running away. This was the life of someone who had chosen to start over. How did you find me? I asked. Stanley pulled out the folder of documents. I found these in your house. Dad, why didn't you tell me about the lottery? I was quiet for a long time, looking at the papers Stanley had spread between us. Finally, I said, "What would you have done if I had told you?" The question caught Stanley off guard. I would have been happy for you. Would you? I asked gently. Or would you have started treating me differently? Would you have wondered if I was going to give you money? Would you have been nicer to me because of what I had, rather than who I was? Stanley started to protest, but the words died in his throat. He thought about how he had treated me in the months before our fight, how he had viewed my weekly visits as burdens rather than gifts. Would knowing about the money have changed that? Or would it have just made him more tolerant of what he saw as my intrusions? I wanted to know, I continued, if my family loved me for myself. If my presence in your life had any value beyond what I could provide or fix or contribute financially. And what did you learn? Stanley asked, though he was afraid of the answer. I looked at my son, this man I had raised and loved unconditionally for 35 years, and felt a deep sadness mixed with something that might have been relief. I learned that I had been fooling myself for a long time about the nature of our relationship. Stanley felt tears building in his eyes. Dad, I was wrong. What I said to you that day, it was cruel and unfair and it was honest, I interrupted. Stanley, you said what you had been feeling for years. You just finally said it out loud. But I didn't mean it. Didn't you? I asked softly. Stanley, when was the last time you called me just to talk? When was the last time you invited me to dinner because you wanted my company, not because you felt obligated to include me? When was the last time you introduced me to your friends as someone you were proud to have as a father, rather than someone you were managing out of duty? Each question hit Stanley like a separate blow. He realized that he couldn't remember the last time any of those things had happened. Our relationship had become a series of obligations and expectations, devoid of genuine affection or respect. I thought I was being a good son, he whispered. You were being a dutiful son, I said. There's a difference. We sat in silence for several minutes. Outside my window, the church bells of Montefiore began to chime the evening hour. It was a sound I had come to love, marking the peaceful rhythm of my new life. What happens now? Stanley asked. I looked at this man who was my son, who had traveled thousands of miles to find me, who was sitting in my living room with tears on his face and regret in his voice. I thought about the years of pain and disappointment that had led us to this moment. I thought about the anger and resentment I had carried for so long, and then I thought about the community I had found here in Montefiore, the people who had welcomed me without knowing anything about my past or my money. I thought about the peace I had discovered in this simple life and the spiritual growth I had begun to experience. I don't know, I said honestly. I said, I'm not the same person who left Ohio 6 weeks ago, and I don't think you're the same person who told me to get out of your house. Stanley nodded, wiping his eyes. I'm not. I know that what I did was unforgivable, but even as he said it, I could see something changing in his face. The desperation and guilt were still there, but underneath them was something else. A glimmer of hope that maybe, somehow, this could still be fixed. What Stanley didn't yet understand was that some things, once broken, could never be put back together in quite the same way. But sometimes, if you were very lucky and very patient, they could be rebuilt into something entirely new. Stanley stayed in Montefiore for 3 days, not in my house. I wasn't ready for that level of intimacy yet, but in the small hotel in the village center. Each day he would walk up the hill to my villa, and we would sit in my garden or living room, talking in a way we hadn't talked in years. On the second day, I took him to meet Father Antonio, the priest of the local church who had become an unexpected friend during my first weeks in Italy. Father Antonio spoke excellent English, having studied in Boston for several years, and he had been instrumental in helping me settle into the community. Your father speaks often of you, Father Antonio told Stanley as we sat in the church courtyard. He carries much love, but also much pain. Stanley looked at me with surprise. You talk about me? Of course I do, I said. Stanley, just because I left doesn't mean I stopped loving you. It means I finally loved myself enough to stop accepting treatment that was destroying both of us. That evening, Stanley asked me about the spiritual community I had mentioned. I explained how Father Antonio had introduced me to a small group of expatriates and locals who met weekly for Bible study and fellowship. They came from different backgrounds: a retired English teacher, an Italian widow, a German artist, an American couple who had moved to Italy to run a bed and breakfast. "What drew you to them?" Stanley asked. "They welcomed me without questions," I said. "They didn't need to know about my past, my money, my family situation. They just accepted me as Charles, a man looking for meaning in the second half of his life." Through this group, I explained, I had been learning about forgiveness, not just the kind of forgiveness that excuses bad behavior, but the kind that frees the forgiver from the burden of resentment and anger. I realized that I had been carrying hurt for so long that it had become part of my identity, I told Stanley. I was the father who wasn't appreciated, the man who wasn't valued. That anger was poisoning me. Stanley listened intently as I described the process of learning to let go. "But how do you forgive someone who hasn't even apologized?" he asked. "You forgive them for your own sake, not theirs," I said. "Forgiveness isn't about saying that what happened was okay. It's about choosing not to let what happened continue to hurt you." On Stanley's final day in Montefiore, I took him to my favorite place, a small olive grove behind my house where I had been spending my mornings in prayer and reflection. We sat on a stone bench overlooking the valley, watching the sun rise over the hills. "Dad," Stanley said quietly, "I need you to know that I understand what I did. Not just the fight we had, but years of taking you for granted, years of treating your love like it was owed to me instead of treasured." I nodded, feeling the weight of his words. "I also need you to know that I don't expect you to come back," he continued. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I just needed you to know that I finally see who you really are, and I'm ashamed that it took losing you for me to realize what I had." We sat in silence for several minutes, listening to the church bells mark another hour in this peaceful place I had come to call home. "Stanley," I said finally, "I want to tell you something. When I first moved here, I was angry. I was hurt and bitter and determined to prove that I could be happy without any of you. But the people here, this community, they've taught me something important about grace." I turned to look at my son, this man I had raised and loved despite all our difficulties. "Grace isn't something we earn. It's something we give freely, the way God gives it to us. And I've learned that holding on to anger, even justified anger, is like drinking poison and hoping the other person gets sick." Stanley's eyes filled with tears. "Are you saying you forgive me?" "I'm saying I choose to forgive you," I said carefully. "Not because what you did was acceptable, but because I refuse to let it continue to poison my heart." "But Stanley, forgiveness doesn't mean everything goes back to the way it was." He nodded, understanding. "What does it mean then?" I stood up and walked to the edge of the grove, looking out over the valley where I had found so much peace. "It means that if you want to rebuild our relationship, we start from here, from honesty about who we really are and what we really want from each other. No more obligation, no more duty, just two people choosing to love each other despite our flaws." "I want that," Stanley said quickly, "more than anything." "Then you need to understand that this is my home now," I said, gesturing to the villa, the grove, the village below us. "I'm not coming back to Ohio. I'm not going back to being the father who gets invited to dinner out of obligation or called when something needs to be fixed. If we're going to have a relationship, it has to be one where we both choose to participate because we genuinely want to be part of each other's lives." Stanley stood and joined me at the edge of the grove. "I understand, and I want you to know that I'd like to visit again, if you'll have me. Not to convince you to come home, but to get to know the man you've become here." That afternoon, I drove Stanley to the airport in Florence. As we said goodbye, he hugged me tighter than he had in years. "I love you, Dad," he said. "Not because you're my father, but because you're a good man who deserved better than I gave you." "I love you too, Stanley," I said, "and I'm proud of the man you're becoming." After Stanley's plane departed, I drove back to Montefiore, feeling lighter than I had in months. That evening, I attended our weekly fellowship meeting and shared what had happened with my spiritual community. Forgiveness is a process, Father Antonio reminded me. It's not something that happens once and is finished. It's a choice we make again and again. 6 months later, Stanley returned to visit me in Italy, this time bringing his wife and children. Miranda was different too, humbler, more genuine in her interactions with me. The children, who had barely known their grandfather before, delighted in exploring my garden and learning simple Italian phrases from the villagers. During that visit, Stanley asked me about the money for the first time since he had discovered my lottery winnings. "Dad, what are you going to do with all of it?" I smiled, thinking about the conversation I had had with my financial advisor the week before. I'm going to live comfortably, travel a little, and give most of it away to causes that matter to me. Money was never the point, Stanley. Freedom was the point. And did you find it? Freedom? I looked around my terrace where we were sharing dinner as the sun set over the Tuscan hills. My son and his family were laughing at something one of the children had said. Father Antonio was joining us later for dessert. My neighbor Giuseppe had brought fresh vegetables from his garden. Yes, I said. I found exactly what I was looking for. Today, 2 years after that first terrible fight, Stanley and I have a relationship unlike anything we ever had before. We video call every Sunday, not because we feel obligated to, but because we genuinely enjoy each other's company. He visits Italy twice a year, and I've even been back to Ohio once to meet his new business partner and see how he's changed the way he treats the people in his own life. Our relationship isn't perfect, no relationship is, but it's honest, and it's built on choice rather than obligation. Stanley has become the kind of son who calls to share good news, who asks for advice because he values my perspective, who tells his friends about his father with pride rather than duty. And I've become the kind of father who gives love freely without keeping score, who offers wisdom without demanding gratitude, who has learned that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the freedom to choose whether they want you in their life. The $18 million is still there, growing in carefully managed investments, but the real treasure I found wasn't money. It was the peace that comes from knowing who you are and refusing to settle for relationships that diminish that truth. In the end, Stanley didn't just find his father in the hills of Tuscany. He found himself. And I didn't just find freedom from a toxic relationship. I found forgiveness, grace, and a kind of love that doesn't keep score. Sometimes the best thing you can do for someone you love is show them what it looks like to love yourself. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, they'll learn to do the same. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.